It was supposed to be the happiest trip of their lives, a Mediterranean honeymoon cruise across the open sea. But just 9 days after saying, "I do," 26-year-old George Smith vanished without a trace from a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. And when dawn broke over the coast of Turkey, a dark red blood stain on the lifeboat canopy was the only clue he'd ever been there at all. This wasn't a case of someone falling overboard. Not to his family, not to the witnesses who heard strange noises in the night, and not to those who knew George best. Something happened on that ship. Something violent, something horrifying. And almost 2 decades later, the people who loved George Smith are still searching for justice. The disappearance happened in July 2005 aboard the Brilliance of the Seas, a cruise liner sailing from Barcelona. George was newly married to Jennifer Hagel, a beautiful outgoing schoolteacher. The young couple had just celebrated their wedding in a dreamy oceanside ceremony. But their honeymoon would turn into a nightmare that still haunts investigators and the public to this day. George vanished sometime between the early hours of July 5th and sunrise. His wife was later found unconscious in a hallway. Blood was found on a lifeboat cover just below their cabin balcony. And a group of young men, the last to see him alive, claimed they put him to bed drunk and left, but the timelines don't quite add up, and neither does the behavior that followed. What really happened to George Smith that night? Was it a tragic accident, a robbery gone wrong, or something more sinister? George Smith IV was the kind of person who lit up a room, tall, good-looking, quick to laugh. He had that easy charm people don't forget. Friends described him as the guy everyone wanted to have a beer with. His father called him the life of the store, referring to the family's liquor business in Greenwich, Connecticut, which George had been preparing to take over. He wasn't just friendly, he was ambitious. George had big plans to grow the family business, modernize it, and carry the Smith name into the future. His parents were proud. His sister adored him. He had a close bond with his family, especially his mom, who still hears his voice every night before she falls asleep. Then came Jennifer. George met her through mutual friends. She was vibrant, funny, and had a natural energy that matched his own. They dated for 3 years before getting married in an elegant seaside ceremony in Newport, Rhode Island. The kind of wedding people talk about for years. The kind where everyone's smiling, dancing, and taking too many pictures. Their honeymoon cruise through the Mediterranean was meant to be a romantic getaway before starting a new chapter together. The ship was filled with other couples, families, and young travelers, including a group of Russian-American men in their early 20s, Zachary and Greg Rosenberg, their cousin Rusty Kaufman, and a friend named Josh Askin. These young men quickly made themselves known on the ship, loud, social, and always partying. They drank heavily, stayed up late, and became fast acquaintances with George and Jennifer. For the first few days, things seemed normal. Drinks at the casino, laughs at the bar, but underneath the fun, something was brewing, something that no one, not even George, could have seen coming. July 4th, 2005. The last full night George Smith would ever be seen alive. That evening, George and Jennifer were drinking and gambling in the ship's casino. Witnesses said both had been partying hard. George wasn't a heavy drinker, but that night he'd had more than usual. By midnight, the newlyweds were visibly intoxicated. Still, they kept the night going, hopping between bars and mingling with a group of young men they'd befriended earlier in the trip. Around 2:30 a.m., George left the casino and headed toward the ship's nightclub, the Disco. With him was Zachary, Greg, Rusty, and Josh. Jennifer left separately, and some witnesses claimed she was accompanied by the ship's casino manager. That detail would be debated for years. At the Disco, George kept drinking. He was reportedly slouched in a chair, barely able to sit up. Around 4 a.m., the group helped him back to his cabin. According to their own statements, they laid him down in bed, took off his shoes, and made sure he was okay. George was said to be grateful. even hugging and thanking the guys for helping him. But here's where things get murky. At around the same time, other passengers in nearby rooms reported hearing what sounded like a struggle. Furniture moving, loud voices, and something that sounded like an argument coming from George's cabin. Then a loud thud, so loud and jarring that a retired police officer staying nearby called it horrific. That sound was later believed to be George's body hitting the metal canopy below his balcony. By sunrise, he was gone. Jennifer was found unconscious in a hallway not far from their room. She had no memory of what happened. George's cabin showed signs of chaos. And from the overhang below, passengers spotted a large blood stain. George Smith had vanished, and the only trace of him was the blood he left behind. When George Smith was reported missing, the cruise ship was already docked in Kusadasi, Turkey. Turkish police boarded the vessel to begin an investigation, while Royal Caribbean's internal security documented the scene. But from the start, the process felt off. Evidence wasn't handled thoroughly. Key timelines were unclear, and the stories from witnesses didn't always match up. The group of young men who helped George to his cabin, Zachary, Greg, Rusty, and Josh, all said they left him safely asleep around 4 a.m., but a fellow passenger swore he saw 3 men exiting George's room shortly after that. Not 4. So where was the 4th, and what happened in those missing minutes? Then came a bombshell. A few days after George's disappearance, a video surfaced. In it, the young men, the same ones who had been with George that night, were joking about his death. They laughed, made sarcastic comments about him parachuting off the balcony, and mocked the situation in a way that was cruel and chilling. One even referenced how much money George had supposedly had in his cabin. Investigators began to suspect robbery. Could these men have planned to steal from George while he was unconscious? Did something go wrong when he woke up? Meanwhile, lawyers began deposing the young men. Josh Askin invoked his Fifth Amendment right repeatedly, refusing to answer whether George had been murdered or whether he knew what happened. Zachary and Rusty did the same. Only Greg Rosenberg, who had since landed in prison for drug trafficking, agreed to speak more openly, but even his answers raised red flags. Royal Caribbean's internal records complicated things further. The men claimed they'd ordered room service right after leaving George's cabin as their alibi. But logs showed inconsistencies. The calls weren't what they claimed. And more importantly, none of them could account for the critical moments when George went overboard. Jennifer, too, was questioned. Some thought she knew more than she let on. But both she and the casino manager passed FBI polygraphs. That left the spotlight squarely on the 4 young men, and a lot of unanswered questions. Despite years of effort, there was never a formal trial. The FBI spent over 9 years investigating George Smith's disappearance. They interviewed witnesses, analyzed cruise ship records, reviewed video footage, and followed every available lead. But in the end, they couldn't bring charges against anyone. There were no arrests, no indictments, and no one officially named as a suspect. The main issue? A lack of direct evidence. George's body was never recovered. There were no surveillance cameras on the balcony where he supposedly fell, and while the blood stain was alarming, it wasn't enough to conclusively prove murder without a body or weapon. Lawyers and private investigators tried to build a civil case. Some argued that the group of young men should have been held accountable, at the very least, for negligence or obstruction. But without criminal charges, there was no trial, no cross-examination, and no verdict. The FBI eventually closed the case, stating that it was possibly accidental. That conclusion devastated George's family, who had always believed he was killed. They didn't buy the idea that George, heavily intoxicated or not, simply sat on the railing and slipped off. To them, the blood, the timeline, and the behavior of the men involved all pointed to something much darker. Without a courtroom, there was no justice system to officially weigh the evidence, only speculation, silence, and an overwhelming sense that someone got away with something. After the investigation was closed, George Smith's family was left with nothing but grief and questions. They never stopped believing he was murdered, and they refused to let the case fade into the background. In 2014, nearly a decade after George's disappearance, his parents publicly offered a $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to an arrest and conviction. It wasn't just about closure, it was about accountability. They believed that someone on that ship knew the truth, maybe more than one person, and they hoped the money might finally make someone speak up. Jennifer, George's widow, eventually remarried and moved on with her life, but she remained a controversial figure in the case. Some believed she knew more than she admitted. Others said she was simply another victim of that night, emotionally shattered, just trying to survive. Royal Caribbean also faced criticism. People questioned how such a major cruise line allowed a passenger to go overboard without being detected. How did it take hours to notice he was gone? Why wasn't the scene secured properly? And why were key witnesses allowed to roam freely or even leave the ship in the early stages of the investigation? George's case became one of the most publicized cruise ship disappearances in American history. It raised awareness about safety gaps at sea, inspired policy discussions, and forced cruise lines to answer difficult questions. But despite the headlines, despite the documentaries, and despite the family's tireless efforts, no one has been held responsible. His parents still keep a photo of George by their bedside. They still think about the call that changed their lives, and they still wonder who, out there, knows the truth. There's something especially haunting about a mystery without an ending. When someone disappears without a trace, no confession, no trial, no answers, the pain never settles. It just lingers. George Smith IV wasn't just a headline. He was a son, a brother, a husband, and a friend. He laughed easily, dreamed big, and had his whole life ahead of him. One night on a cruise ship, one night that should have been about celebration, stole all of that away. Maybe it was alcohol. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was something darker than any of us want to admit. But what's clear is that someone knows what happened that night, and silence has kept the truth hidden for almost 20 years. Justice isn't just about courts and convictions. Sometimes it's about refusing to forget, about asking hard questions again and again, even when the answers don't come. George's family never stopped asking, and neither should we. Because stories like this don't just tell us about crime, they show us what happens when justice slips through the cracks, and what it means to fight year after year to pull it back, to pull it back, to